Strap in everybody, because it's time to pick apart the successes of one of the most famous video games of all time, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Released for the Nintendo 64 in November of 1998, this action-adventure title was monumentally successful and integral in pushing 3D video games into an entirely new frontier. Like many large-scale Nintendo 64 games, Ocarina of Time was intended to be developed for the 64DD peripheral. Unlike most games that were either abandoned or reshaped due to the commercial failure of the 64DD, Ocarina of Time was actually migrated to cartridge format because it was able to load the massive amounts of character models and real-time animations easier than could be managed on a disc. Especially with a uniquely doubled cartridge size from 16 to 32 megabytes, the largest game released by Nintendo at the time. The development team was also larger than expected. Over 200 people worked on the game, which was far from commonplace in 1998's gaming ecosystem. For a little Nintendo context, both Super Mario 64 and the last mainline Zelda game, A Link to the Past, each featured under 50 team members, and that's including credits for categories like localization and special thanks. Development for Link's movements and the unique Chanbara-inspired combat required the involvement of over 120 people alone. Though Ocarina of Time was released 2 years into its lifespan, the Nintendo 64 didn't even have 100 titles available in its library at this point. Meanwhile, the PlayStation had over 500. The last title to be released from any of Nintendo's first-party IPs was Star Fox 64 over a year prior. Super Mario 64 was 2 years old at this point, and Donkey Kong wouldn't make his first 3D appearance until November of '99. This is also one of the closest instances of a pure RPG that Nintendo 64 owners had access to. Both Square and Enix, though prolific on the Super Nintendo, had moved on to the disc-based system of Sony's PlayStation, and without any first-party entries in franchises like Fire Emblem or Mother, RPG fans on Nintendo's hardware had very few options. This was actually a huge problem for Nintendo and the sales of the Nintendo 64. By November of '98, anyone with a PlayStation at home, despite it being older hardware, would have access to some of the greatest RPGs of gaming history, including Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy Tactics. Many critics and hungry fans agreed that the Nintendo 64 wouldn't survive much longer without a big holiday title. In Japan, Ocarina of Time sold over 380,000 copies in its first week, even surpassing the impressive success of Metal Gear Solid on Sony's rival PlayStation that same holiday season. While Ocarina of Time sold almost 1 million copies in Japan by the end of 1998, during the same time span, releasing just 39 days before the end of the year, the United States still reached 2.5 million copies sold in '98 alone. By the time the dust settled, Nintendo had a more than brag-worthy 7.5 million sales for their puttering console. Now, numbers are one thing, but how good could this game really be? Well, to find out the answer to that, we'll have to consider what's so great about The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. In comparison to virtually every other game in the market at this point, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time feels so much more grand, elaborate, and mystical. Even the opening shots of Link riding Epona through Hyrule Field display huge sweeping shots of land that had never really been done in a video game up until this point. You could count the large worlds of computer RPGs like Elder Scrolls Arena or Daggerfall, but in those games, the world itself wasn't what was intended to be explored, other than finding the next town or dungeon. The reason that so many players can still pick up Ocarina of Time and play it just as they would Breath of the Wild is because this 1998 game was such a revolutionary step in 3D gaming that action-adventures really haven't changed much since then. While the world and its inhabitants may feel overly polygonal, there's not really much outside of a graphical sense that this game is missing from any other modern title. Following just a few lines of ambiguous exposition, players are introduced to Link, Zelda, and Ganon, the three ever-recurring characters of the Legend of Zelda franchise. Of course, new players wouldn't know who they are yet, but those who had experienced Nintendo's previous adventures will immediately recognize the trifecta in stunning 3D graphics. This flash from the player's future is immediately followed by some classic Zelda exposition about the fate of the world being threatened once more, though we discover that hope still lies in the fate of one young boy who lives in the forest. In case the visual scope of the game didn't really click during the title screen, the first shots we see of the world are from a fairy's perspective as she flies through Kokiri Forest. And while that all seems pretty straightforward now, what was really impressive here was the fact that it was all in-engine. This means that the game didn't split off to a pre-rendered cutscene like it would in most PlayStation games. Instead, everything we see from Navi's perspective is all running in real time. And before we really get into the shoes of our protagonist, let's talk about Navi, the other character we'll spend the entirety of the game with. While she's gone down in history as a meme-worthy nuisance, Navi was still a great attempt at creating a guidance system that the player could access at virtually any point in the game, and she's honestly really useful in that sense. Whenever returning from a long break between sessions, players could simply ask her where they needed to go or what they were in the middle of doing, and pick up where they left off. The problem really only lies with how frequently she'll butt in with advice that you didn't ask for, including a notification system that can't be disabled or easily ignored. Otherwise, Navi is a feature much more worth having than not, also acting as a cursor to verify exactly what the player is focused on for either conversation or combat, no matter if the camera is cooperating or not. Honestly, once Link reaches adulthood, Navi stops being much of a pester at all, assuming the player is finding new stuff to do and not just getting lost. I think she's really just meant to be more of a tutorial guide for both young Link and younger members of the audience. I think we just remember her popping up so much because people who played it non-stop at release were wandering around at their own pace, not explicitly proceeding through the quest. So it's fair to say that her presence is counterproductive in terms of player freedom, but outside of including a written quest list in the menu or something, it would have been difficult to properly guide players in any more of a fitting manner at this time in history. Not to mention, she is her own character. She has her own dialogue, though very infrequent, which isn't necessarily meant to aid the player, but just contribute to world building. The fact that all of the other inhabitants of Link's village have their own fairies effectively acts as a highlighting system for new players, because the fairies themselves can be rendered from much further away than the Kokiri's 3D models. This allows players to recognize the draw distance in large areas, as well as find their way around comfortably when all of the NPCs aren't placed in a single view for the player to speak to. We'll talk about them more in a bit once we get to the various characters and world building witnessed throughout Hyrule, but it wasn't until I noticed this fact about the Kokiri's fairies that I started to recognize that even the Gorons and Zora have means of limiting their demands on the N64's hardware as well. The Gorons roll up into balls to limit the surface area of their models, while the Zora will only be notable by where the player can see bubbles rising in the water. These are each fantastic, easily overlooked means of incorporating the in-universe behavior of these characters with the limits of the hardware it's running on. Compared to using directional buttons to play Medieval or Spyro on PlayStation, the use of the Nintendo 64's analog stick is a breath of fresh air and an immediately commendable feature in Ocarina of Time's 3D gameplay. As the player begins their adventure and explores Kokiri Forest, they'll learn plenty about how to control Link and properly explore this revolutionary 3D world. Various NPCs and signs will explain the game's mechanics near a possible site to practice, and even reward players who give it a shot. This system of positive reinforcement exists throughout the game as a means of encouraging the player to explore as well as gain a better understanding of controlling their character. Many games like the Zora Diving Challenge or the Shooting Gallery in Hyrule Market aren't the end-all be-all of excitement, but they're carefree means of introducing the player to both basic and advanced functions in a 3D environment. All of these puzzles, challenges, and side quests also present the player with upgrades that are often completely optional, though the important ones are awarded to players that have proven they'll be able to handle the upcoming challenges of the main quest. Once they have the hang of controlling our hero, the player doesn't even have to go exploring very far in order to find the first dungeon, which coincidentally is inside the husk of a giant dying tree, just like the first dungeon in the original Legend of Zelda on the NES. The first dungeon is brilliantly structured for showing players how to play Ocarina of Time. I remember how long the Deku Tree took me to beat as a child because players do actually have to learn about environmental puzzles and how to solve them. However, without throwing an onslaught of enemies at the player, Nintendo introduced core mechanics for the rest of the game such as how to fire ranged weapons, deflect projectiles, and even the concept of moving between floors fluidly to utilize the height or shape of the dungeon for both puzzles and exploration. The majority of enemies inside of the Great Deku Tree are actually stationary too, such as the Deku Baba, Deku Shrubs, and Skulltulas. This gives players plenty of opportunities to practice both attacking, defending, and possibly just avoiding enemies with unique attack patterns. The Deku Babas also demonstrate the fact that some enemies have specific weak points that are only accessible in certain instances, and should be stricken in a particular manner for critical damage. The Hanging Skulltulas have a similar feature, being if the player only tries to defeat them with a sword, they'll have to wait for the monster to reveal its soft back. But if the player uses a slingshot even when the Skulltula is out of reach, they can defeat it without waiting. Though there's no way of knowing what they're all for at the beginning of the game, the pause screen shows several pages of collectibles and empty slots for information that will all be gathered as the player progresses. But the empty trophy case presentation makes collecting these upgrades and items much more enticing than A Link to the Past's solid black inventory. It's never even come to mind across multiple playthroughs of this game, but the fact that saving is tied to the cancel button in the menu is a brilliant idea, because it forces players who would otherwise forget to routinely save their progress in this massive adventure by quickly providing the prompt as they close the menu anyway. From the equipment subscreen, players can assign up to 3 items, like a slingshot, bottle, etc., to the bottom 3 yellow buttons on the N64 controller. This is one of the biggest features in making this game run smoothly, as it allows players to interact with enemies and the game's entire world however they see fit. There's no need to go swapping one equipable item at a time, and this even means that combat could be more involved than turn-based games because different items or equipment could be utilized to attack your foe's weaknesses. Arrows, hookshots, and bombs could all be used at the player's discretion as they navigate puzzles and obstacles, unlike anything that had been seen before. This wasn't just jumping from platform to platform or slashing wildly at whichever enemy reached you first. The combat in Ocarina of Time, which is still hardly outdated by even today's standards, was so revolutionary that some versions of its equipment, camera, and movement mechanics have all found their ways into the combat of most other third-person action-adventure games since then. For a video game that toes the line between both RPG and adventure, this was probably the biggest step in free-flowing video game combat since Chrono Trigger. The basic format for third-person real-time combat introduced in Ocarina of Time allowed for the evolution of action RPGs into the sword-swinging adventures we've seen in franchises like The Witcher or From Software's Souls-like games. While there technically are an impressive number of options for lunging, stabbing, and swiping featured in Ocarina's gameplay, there's not really a good sense of player education on how to get the most out of the sword-based combat unless players want to read through text-heavy explanations of each possible maneuver. This is definitely one feature that was ironed out in later Zelda games like The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Unlike some of Nintendo's previous 3D adventures like Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, the entirety of Ocarina of Time's world is interconnected, not relying on a level-based system to separate all of the game's data. Thanks to the lack of fog to disrupt the player's view, you can even see all the way across large areas such as Hyrule Field or Lake Hylia, which were massive distances to display in a video game at the time. It makes the scope of the game feel much more dramatic to see far-off mountain peaks or buildings along the horizon as players first leave that dimly lit forest. The biggest evolutionary step this entry provided for the Legend of Zelda series as a whole was an absurd amount of world building. Several races of characters were introduced to Hyrule, and virtually all of them had at least one major character to drive home the different cultures and aesthetics of each type of Hyrule inhabitant. Ganon's new human form, Ganondorf, is the first instance we see of a Gerudo, and the same is true for Impa and the Sheikah tribe. As for slightly more fantastical races, the Zora have been changed from sea monsters to elegant mermaid-like creatures, and the Goron also make an appearance as the hard-skinned mountain-dwelling race. The Hyrule Marketplace has to be one of the most lively representations of a town in a video game up until that point. It's full of idle villagers, just like any RPG, but the unique 3D models of all the townspeople laughing, running, and otherwise going about their lives was a whole other level of world building in 1998. While Kakariko Village isn't as lively as the market within a single sweep of the camera, it does convey that cozy mountain town aesthetic as a nice contrast to the bustling city. Much like the pendants found in A Link to the Past, the first quest featured in Ocarina of Time requires the player to collect 3 magical stones imbued with the power of Hyrule's 3 major goddesses, after which, players will be able to wield the fabled Master Sword and travel through time between 2 fixed points before and after Ganondorf's rise to power. Instead of a sense of wonder or power ourselves once the player claims the Master Sword and reaches adulthood, we're instead met with an overpowering sense of dread. As the player steps out of the Temple of Time, they immediately witness the foreboding atmosphere of Death Mountain in the distance. It only gets worse from there as the player begins to realize the state of the world 7 years after Ganondorf seized control of Hyrule. After collecting the Master Sword for the first time, and jumping ahead 7 years into the future, the player is freely able to travel through time, back and forth, from adult to child, though they may not realize this, as it may just feel like the natural progression of the narrative to jump to adulthood and simply stay that way for the latter half of the game. However, by the time the player begins searching for the last few temples, there will be more and more hints at puzzles which can only be solved as your younger self. Sheik even tells you that you'll need to travel through time to finish your journey. This mandatory instance of returning to Link's youth also gives players a chance to do some extra exploring or tie up any loose ends of side quests as a child, now that they're far more familiar with the game. The use of different elements as the theme for each dungeon players explore as adult Link was a great way of including various environments, just like in Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, without making the transition between each setting too jarring. This wasn't too much of a stretch for the Zelda series anyhow, as the majority of dungeons in all previous titles focused on various motifs, whether that be an enemy type or visual design. I won't go over too much of the content that players can expect to find throughout this game's experience, especially in the adult half, but I am going to go out on a limb here and say that the Water Temple gets way more flack than it deserves. It's honestly one of the best designed dungeons in terms of 3D exploration, because it allows for the greatest sense of vertical exploration due to the adjustable water levels. I feel like there were only two things that muddled the experience of the Water Temple in the original Nintendo 64 release of the game. First would be how arduous it is to equip and unequip the iron boots. Obviously, having to pause and change equipment grinds the entire experience to a halt, and before you know it, the player has forgotten where they were even headed because they had to pause and unpause 4 times to get through a hallway. The second problem is simply not being able to locate the 3 water switches after you've previously accessed them. Some sort of icon on the map or a shortcut would have really helped keep things moving, because once again, the equipment you're using in this dungeon causes extra wasted time if you accidentally head in the wrong direction. Other than that, the enemies in the Water Temple all have very explicit weaknesses and don't get in the way for too long. The fight with Dark Link is well presented thematically, but it doesn't work as well as one of those enemies in A Link to the Past or Link's Awakening that just mirrors your motions. Having all of your defensive moves and more, Dark Link far outmatches the player in terms of basic capabilities. This disincentivizes the player against what could have been an exciting duel of clashing swords, which, even in the Zelda series, doesn't happen too often. The Iron Knuckle enemy found in the Shadow Temple seems like a perfect example of what the fight with Dark Link could have been, albeit a bit slower. Anyway, I suppose to sum up, the Water Temple has one of the best dungeon designs on paper, and while the execution and pacing fell a bit by the wayside, it's still underrated for its ideas and overall structure. While music has very often been important to the Legend of Zelda series in one way or another for nearly its entire existence, Ocarina of Time was really the first in the series to make that a defining trait of the game's experience. This is one of the rare instances of a musical video game that has nothing to do with rhythm or dance, as we would expect from anything defined as a music game, like Guitar Hero or DDR. However, in Ocarina of Time, not only is the soundtrack incredible and memorable, but it's thoroughly and impressively entwined with the rest of the game's design. The music actively contributes to the player's experience. Music can be used as clues to puzzles, like in the Lost Woods, or at the player's convenience, such as when changing the time of day with the Sun Song or summoning your steed Epona. It's also used for purposes of story, such as Saria's song, as well as for major functions and player exploration, between the songs that change time, as well as those that transport Link to various locations around Hyrule. It's worth briefly mentioning how novel the whole music playing mechanic really was. I mean, Parappa the Rapper was essentially the start of the rhythm game genre, and it was only a year old at this point. The idea of playing an instrument in a video game was pretty unique, let alone using it as some form of magic puzzle-solving device. It also reinforced the player's experience by connecting the soundtrack to the game itself with unique, memorable tunes, some of which had already had a history with the Zelda franchise. In Ocarina of Time, every song, whether debuting or returning, has a nice in-universe tie-in to its power, in respect to where or from whom you learn it. For example, the Composer Brothers hiding their melody that controls time in the graveyard of Kakariko, or Saria sharing the melody of the forest with you. These connections also help the player more easily memorize all 12 melodies, without it feeling like homework, as they simply recall the people and places they've seen throughout their journey. While it only seems natural that Zelda games would be 3D adventures retrospectively, that doesn't mean this series had any less of a monstrous hurdle to overcome in the transition from 2D to 3D than the Super Mario franchise, or any other game for that matter. Other than their attempt at a side-scrolling RPG with Zelda 2, the Legend of Zelda games had only ever been top-down adventures up until this point. Nintendo had to come up with new systems for movement, combat, and camera management in a format that no one had successfully managed, at least to this degree. While Super Mario 64 was equally revolutionary for the platforming genre, Ocarina of Time was about so much more than just selecting a level and then successfully jumping to your objective. It was about stepping into a wide open world that was rife with opportunities for exploration, excitement, and mystery. I feel as though whenever this game is discussed, everyone's looking for that scrap of evidence for or against Ocarina of Time being the best video game of all time, or whatever credit people want to give it. And I guess I'll give my 2 cents, as someone who's trying to take themselves seriously as a critic. As can be seen by the majority of my statements in this video, and I can imagine the experience any of you watching also had if you've ever played this game before, there's just a lot of factors in this title that could not possibly have been done better. Obviously, minor features like draw distance or camera control could be significantly improved with modern capabilities, but it's not as if any video game had come up with a better way of doing things at this point. However, the fact that we can criticize many of this game's features at all is due to the fact that there have been quote-unquote better games since Ocarina of Time's release. Every art form evolves and adapts as time goes on, and trying to say that there is a single perfect or undisputed greatest work of art, whether that be video game, book, or movie, is impossible, even if broken into genres. Keep in mind that there have always been critics, including in the video game world, that love to be the ones with thick skins. There have always been contrarians, hipsters, and tough crowds, yet the majority of those same types of people that were reviewing video games in 1998 still managed to come to a nearly unanimous consensus. And that's a statement that can be spoken as fact no matter your opinion on the game. At the time of release, the majority of critics gave this game a perfect or nearly perfect score. Citizen Kane may not be the perfect movie, Don Quixote may not be the perfect novel, and you can imagine where I'm going from there. But regardless of its place in history, Ocarina of Time is just a great game. If nothing else, the revolutionary technical feats, historic legacy, and accessible freedom for fun-loving players should all be testaments to the potential of video games as both an art form and casual pastime. That is what's so great about The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we dissected the revolutionary release of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Rayman 2: The Great Escape, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.